I'm going to talk, my talk's going to be a lot more general than the previous one. I'm going to talk about all different kinds of permitting and all different kinds of scenarios, not just California air districts. I have worked in about 15 of them on biomass projects now for about 30 years. So I have a pretty good idea which air districts to go to get work done nicely. So anyway, okay. Okay, so anyway, this is my the talk. It's going to be about navigating the biochar permitting process, and not just in California, but sort of think of it as a sort of a generalized approach to things, to at least give you an idea of some of the steps you need to go through, in addition to the great work that the previous speaker talked about in Monterey. That's a tough air district to work with, I know. So a little bit about TSS. We've been around since 1986. We like to say all things biomass. We do all types of biomass besides biochar, electricity, fuels, anaerobic digestion, all of those types of things. And then we have quite a few different kinds of clients for the small firm we are. We have a lot of tribal clients, a lot of public and private sector, and we've also worked for several of the major IOUs in the nation, in Colorado, Minnesota, and a lot in California and Oregon. And we do a lot of things, so I'm not going to go give you the whole list here, but the things I do mostly are feasibility studies, tech evaluations, and of course permitting and compliance work on biomass projects. And I've been in the biomass sector now for several years, thanks mostly to Tom Miles, sort of brought me into the whole mess, so that's good. And so, you know, I think everybody knows the answer here nowadays. Why biochar? It's continuing to gain significant attention for its ability to sequester carbon. I know that's really improved the outlook for it. Again, it's been looked at for soil health and just basically valorizing organic waste. And these environmental benefits are driving the industry pretty rapidly, as we can see by the number of people that are here. But permitting still needs to catch up. Even though many of these projects are small and stuff, it's still a complex regulatory landscape. The regulations vary dramatically from state to region to county to city to air districts to state air agencies, et cetera. And I'm mostly going to talk about land use, air emissions, and environmental impact assessment, and they all require careful navigation. So some of the common pitfalls and traps to avoid: not considering the permitting process early enough. This happens a lot with me when people call me and say they have a project in mind and they've already cited it and not really doing a whole lot of background work on permitting for that site. Misclassifying the technologies, you know, making sure that people understand exactly what you're doing here. It's not a combustion unit per se, like a big biomass plant would be. The other thing we've run into is not having an appropriate engineer. I know there's a lot of vendors of equipment and stuff here, which is great, but sometimes you definitely need an independent engineer that's familiar with biochar systems to assist you, along with the vendor assisting you over your equipment. There's also a lot of vague regulatory language, as the previous speaker pointed out. And that's just in that one area, just dealing with solid waste incinerators. It goes through all facets of permitting, of vague language, and it changes from state to state. And so you have to be very, very careful of that. Misaligned timelines, land use, air permitting, environmental impact assessment of some type. They have different agencies, so there's different schedules going on. And that can really create a problem where you think you're going to have this permit, but this other permit or this other process hasn't been done yet, and you can't get that other permit because they can't sign it until the other agency gets done. So there's a lot of this interesting interaction that's not always smooth. Also failing to engage with the right agencies. And by that, worked in a lot of air districts in California, and there are certain air districts that I do try to avoid. and sometimes advise my clients to avoid these, or also tell them where a good place to site might be. So, jurisdictional variability. One size does not fit all. They're different across land use departments, air agencies and districts, solid waste agencies, and there's solid waste districts, there's water boards, there's water agencies, there's wastewater agencies, there's supply water agencies, and one of the things I always like to point out to people now is fire departments. It's sort of been, it's not really an environmental permit per se, but I like to roll it in there because it has hung up people recently on some projects that I've worked on. And then also what qualifies as a pyrolysis in one state may be regulated as a waste incinerator in another. Even if you don't discount the EPA rules, certain things like, for example, California, if it's not considered woody biomass, you have a difficult time putting that in the system if it's like food waste or something to that effect. And you need to know these in wherever state, county, or wherever that you're citing. As you saw from, again, the previous speaker, air permitting can be the most significant hurdle. Biochar systems can be flagged for combustion-related emissions, very low emissions, subject to best available control technology. We've run into that several times where, think like a state like California where you have, sure, we have to control PM, but many jurisdictions you have to control NOx. And I've run into many biochar developers that weren't aware that they have to figure out how to deal with NOx on their system, and NOx control can be a pricey matter to deal with and difficult on small units. Also, knowing how to classify your technology can make or break the permitting effort. So land use. In California, it's particularly important. It's important actually in several states. I know even in Minnesota, I've done a project in Minnesota, land use was definitely a consideration that you have to go through. Many times the land use permitting agencies are also in charge of the general environmental impact, potential impact of a project. California, of course, has its California Environmental Quality Act, which is sort of NEPA on steroids, but other states, like many states, have some type of an environmental impact process that one has to go through in getting a land use permit or conditional use permit or conditional authorization just to operate the facility. And also, biochar facilities can be seen as industrial, agricultural, or waste management, again, depending on local, state, regional definitions of what people view as a biochar facility. And you're usually dealing with planning departments, and no put down on planning departments, but you realize they're planners and not engineers, so they don't always understand some of the specifics as well as you'd like them to. So sometimes you have to dumb down your project enough to get past the agencies and the staff within there. But there's also sometimes you run in there, they are very knowledgeable. So again, it's what agency you're dealing with. Environmental impact review. Again, that's part of sort of the land use and actually the overall thing. For example, in California, the air districts also require that you have gone through what's called CEQA review or environmental impact review through generally the planning department. Sometimes they do it on their own if the planning department doesn't need to do the CEQA portion. The review can be expensive, depending again your jurisdiction and where you're located, and there is sensitive land things to think about. Rare and endangered ESA, Endangered Species Act, all kinds of you name it. It could be out there, given wherever site you're siting your project on. I always like to tell people to prepare early for the environmental assessments because that many times is next to construction can be one of your longest timelines to get through. So, what are some of the things that I recommend the early engagement with the local agencies, the air districts, neighbors, tribal stakeholders, whoever builds trust and can diffuse opposition. You're trying to get to, lots of times people think, oh, there's nobody that's opposed to this, everybody wants it, and then suddenly somebody comes out of the woodwork. Or in the case of some of the larger biomass projects I've worked on, there are national environmental organizations that do not like biomass conversion. And you have to be aware of them popping into projects. So you need to understand the landscape the best you can. And many times that's good to get consultants or wherever up front right away that maybe can guide you through that process. And also sending the right message. Proactive outreach does usually result in a smoother approval pathways. Finding that most of the agencies like biochar. They've heard about biochar, many of them, most of them nowadays, at least in some of the larger states like California and elsewhere. So usually you have a fairly good response, at least to begin with, when you're dealing with the agencies. But as they'll tell you, we have regulations to follow, and we can be all in favor of your project, but we still need to make sure we're crossing the T's and dotting the I's. So, some of my recommendations in the permitting process. Start early with the permitting. Even siting a project should have upfront permitting review. And probably more in depth in certain areas. Again, if you're in urban areas or near urban areas, many times there's more work to do as opposed to rural areas. I've done a lot of work in rural areas on the West Coast, and the rural areas are much easier to work with. People really want to see projects and jobs, et cetera, so they usually will bend over backwards. Their guidebooks are much thinner, which means less time, less work. A whole variety of things. It's always good. I always suggest to build a permitting roadmap. I do that for all of my clients. Put together, and I do it to where I try to identify all of the agencies that have environmental permits. I've also been adding building permits to that now, and dealing with fire departments. The fire departments I'm finding that they get nervous about these projects sometimes. So they want to make sure everything's being done according to at least the fire code, whatever state or jurisdiction that you're in. So permitting roadmap's good. I also put costs in there, try to give people an idea what the permitting fees are going to be and stuff, because they can add up. Some states, you'll be surprised how expensive their permitting fees are. One state in particular I won't name, it's very expensive for a project that's making biochar. Also engage knowledgeable, as I mentioned before, engineers with biochar and consultants. Sometimes they can be one and the same. I'm not an engineer, although people think I am sometimes, but I'm not. But I think I know enough to guide people through that, and always tell them, okay, you may need a hardcore engineer also on your project. And maintain communication with the regulators. Sometimes if you're not responding back to them right away because maybe you have some more work to do for them to figure out they're going through the permitting process, it's nice to tell them now and then you're working on it, because otherwise sometimes they'll move on to other projects, and you'll get kind of pushed down the ladder review a little bit. And also aligning the project timeline with agency review cycles. And again, this is where I mentioned where you've got to get like 3 or 4 different permits that are all intertwined, but with different agencies. They all can have different time frames on how they do things, and you need to be cognizant of that. So from challenges to opportunities, I think with proper planning, permitting shift can move it from a burden to a strategic advantage, particularly for your next projects once you've gone through it once. Lessons learned, as we always say, but also making sure that you understand that if you're going to a new site, that there could be some issues there too. But by now you've gone through the process, you've taken all the spheres from the agencies and whatnot, so it just really, I think it really helps. And then projects that clear the regulatory path early, position themselves for grants, partnerships, favorable public perception. And then, I think really important nowadays is not prepping you for complying with CDR credit market, which I think is a big revenue stream for many of these biochar projects. So closing, navigating the permitting process is critical for any biochar operation, almost no matter how small. There's pitfalls and traps in all of it. You can avoid the common traps and set your project for long-term success. And so I'm happy to take any questions now. I'm also going to be at the conference through tomorrow evening. So if you want to run into me and have a chat, I'm happy to talk.
So just a comment, Fred, you mentioned roadmaps and permit guides and so on. A lot of states don't have those. We developed a permit guide in Oregon back in the 1980s, upgraded in the 90s. I got Department of Environmental Quality to upgrade it just this last year.
Yep.
And those are very helpful, but how often do you run into a state
Well,
that
that's
has
what,
a permit guide?
well, I mean, California has the CEQA flow chart, which is a monster. I mean, that to go through, you actually need somebody to help you get through that if you're not familiar with CEQA. But I do a job for a particular project. I'm a consultant, so I get paid to work. And so if a client, I always recommend a permitting roadmap, and I will make one for them. And I've done so many of them. I can do them pretty quick, and I've done them in about 10 states, all over the West Coast. And I've looked at permitting operations for biomass in over 27 states. So I can always figure it out.
Well, and you run into some odd situations. We had an issue in Texas where biochar in Texas is regulated by the solid waste department, not by the ag department for use in soil. And so I called a friend of mine who permits compost facilities in Texas and said, well, what do you do? And she said, oh, I know that group in solid waste. Do a lunch and learn. And just show them the process, and that's exactly what we did, and it was smooth sailing from there. It was just a matter of them understanding what biochar was.
I've done the same thing with air districts on small projects, and I've come in and I've shown them, and they said, well, gee, there's really not very many emissions from this thing. And I'm going, yeah, it's a small little unit. And granted, there's still BACT to worry about and all those things, but at least they're kind of got the idea you're not coming in with something that's super exotic, out of the question. No, this is pretty simple stuff in reality, at least from an engineering perspective.
So, any other questions?
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier about some facilities might have NOx issues, and I was curious if if those facilities did some site-specific performance testing to figure that out, or were they using emission factors, the kind of...
Well, because the biochar stuff is still relatively new, there's not a lot of good solid emissions testing, particularly for more stringent states like California, where we have NOx. I mean, PM's easy to control, basically, really is. NOx with biomass material, much more difficult, and it's tough. And I do run into that problem all the time with the developers. They don't have decent data, so we have to go use default data, like EPA's AP42, and that's high numbers. I mean, well, actually, low numbers, bad numbers, I should say bad numbers, not great numbers. So, yeah, it's a problem, and I run into that constantly, even in other projects besides biochar. It's just sort of the nature of the game.
No, and years ago, for burning these gases efficiently, we would design highly mixed burners, basically highly mixed flames. But to get low NOx, you want staged combustion and low NOx. And you can actually get some low NOx numbers from pyrolysis gases, but never low enough for California.
Well, even in some of in some of the air districts, the BACT levels for like NOx and stuff is like 0 emissions. Okay, so you've got to look at BACT. And if you're dealing with biomass, they'll say, well, there's BACT for handling biomass. combustion and gasification, and it's pretty low. And your project's not going to go forward without you at least doing the analysis of the BACT.